Welcome, everyone, to the Information's TITV. My name is Leo Schwartz, and I'll be filling in for Akash today. It is Friday, August 28th. Today on the show, the Information has exclusive reporting that the Trump administration is working on new rules that would limit China's remote access to chips. We'll then have more details surrounding Anthropic's highly anticipated blockbuster IPO expected later this year and how it might be different from other big tech listings this year. We'll then turn to data centers, which have become one of the most hotly debated issues ahead of this year's midterm elections. We'll look at both sides of the policy debate and what it could mean for future regulations. And to close out the show, 116 companies signed a letter calling for businesses and policymakers to prioritize cybersecurity in the age of AI. We've got a special edition of the editor's cut where we'll break it all down. It's going to be a great show, so let's get right into it. This morning, The Information published exclusive reporting that the Trump administration is working on a rule that could cut off a key loophole allowing Chinese AI firms to access advanced U.S. chips. To talk about the finer points of export controls, we have Michelle Nee, a visiting fellow at the Center for a New American Security, who is one of the experts featured in our article. Michelle, let's start with the basics here. What has been the Trump administration's approach to handling export controls of AI chips to China?
Hi, Leo. Thanks for having me on. The Trump administration rightly needs to weigh many different considerations from commercial interests and economic interests to national security risks. So their approach in export controls has really been to strike a balance between all of those.
And what did they change from the Biden administration?
Yeah, the Biden administration was more heavy-handed on export controls. They really, valued the national security considerations of exporting chips to China, and they were more willing to export control those chips. And I think the, Trump administration has been more open to weighing a wide host of different considerations. So, as you reported, the Biden era saw the AI diffusion rule, which was a pretty comprehensive framework that determined which countries in the world could receive how many chips. And the Trump administration has been quite vocal in criticizing this framework and wanting to rescind it and replace it with a new one.
So, in the wake of that replacement, which we reported about today, critics argue there are loopholes in the current approach. Remote access, I know, is chief among them. Can you just break down what the remote access loophole is and why it matters?
Sure. So, Chinese companies are accessing large swaths of compute remotely, and this is compute in the form of NVIDIA advanced chips such as Blackwells that they would otherwise not be able to buy outright themselves, but they're able to access through cloud computing providers, most notably in Southeast Asia, but also cases have popped up where they're customers of American cloud providers as well and accessing that compute. And they're using this compute to train often very advanced models. For example, Michael Kratsios, the director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, recently said that Moonshot AI used remote access to train its latest Kimi K3 model. So we're seeing quite advanced models being used, using remote access to train these innovations.
So, why has this not been closed yet? What are the challenges of closing the remote access loophole? Does Commerce even have the authority to do this?
So there are debates over whether Commerce has existing authority to regulate remote access. The Bureau of Industry and Security has not interpreted its authority to extend to cloud services, and they've expressed this in several advisory opinions. Um, so it's unclear whether BIS or Commerce currently has the authority to regulate remote access. But either way, this authority should be clarified in order for BIS to actually make rules about it.
So we reported in our story this morning that there's a small group within the Commerce Department that's working on a replacement to that Biden era diffusion rule that you mentioned. You talked about this a bit, but what have been the ups and downs of the Trump administration's approach to the diffusion rule, actually rescinding the Biden one, coming up with a new one? What's been happening there?
So the Trump administration has not formally rescinded the AI diffusion rule. They announced in May 2025 that they would be rescinding it, and shortly after, BIS announced that it would not be enforcing the diffusion rule. Now, this approach has created some national security risks in that it left open a loophole through which Chinese subsidiaries abroad were able to purchase advanced NVIDIA chips. So that loophole was closed in May 2026. However, in the meantime, experts estimate that potentially hundreds of thousands of advanced chips were bought by Chinese subsidiaries abroad.
So we reported this morning that if there is a new diffusion rule that's being worked on, it's likely to address that issue of remote access. Obviously, you mentioned a different loophole that was previously closed. If remote access is addressed in a new rule, what would the impact of that be to Chinese AI companies and US chip manufacturers?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, Chinese companies are getting a large amount of their compute remotely through cloud computing providers, and they're using that to train their most advanced models. So if they didn't have access to this compute, they would need to find other methods or ways of training and accessing compute. And so that would definitely slow down their AI ambitions.
And then what about for US companies? Because I know with the previous diffusion rule under Biden, there was a lot of pushback from US companies as well. There was accusations that it could hurt US competitiveness of semiconductor manufacturing or other similar companies in the US.
Yeah, that has definitely been the pushback from industry. There's also been pushback from allies as well that weren't included in the tier one of that AI diffusion rule framework. That those countries were able to get relatively unlimited access to chips. So it's clear that there were some flaws in the old uh, AI diffusion rule under the Biden era. However, this diffusion rule did also include a stipulation to control remote access, which it seems like the Trump administration replacement is also considering. So that will be critical to protect national security.
I mean, given the track record of the current Bureau of Industry and Security and the Commerce Department, what do you think the likelihood is that they'll actually advance new rules?
I think their ability to advance new rules without some sort of clarified authority, either by this AI diffusion rule replacement, or something like the Remote Access Security Act, which would clarify BIS's authority to regulate remote access. I think without one of those actions clarifying their authority, they might be unlikely to regulate remote access on their own. I think, yeah, having at least one of those in place would definitely make it more likely that they would regulate remote access.
What's happening with the congressional effort that would actually give Commerce authority to do that?
Yeah, so Congress is weighing the Remote Access Security Act, which is a bipartisan bill that would regulate remote access and extend export controls to remote access. It has currently passed the House of Representatives. It's still awaiting action by the Senate. But if passed, this would give BIS the authority to regulate remote access. Now, BIS would still have to create a rule to actually export control remote access, but their authority to do so would be clarified.
Yeah. I mean, do you think, obviously, given the fact that the previous iteration under Biden did face serious pushback? I know there was a draft of this that was released in March by the Trump administration that got a lot of pushback. What do you think would happen with a new iteration of this? What type of pushback might it receive?
Yeah, any new rule is going to have pushback from industry, from countries around the world. I think the Trump administration has signaled that it would want to do a more inclusive approach to any replacement to the diffusion rule, which, yeah, I think would definitely make allies and partners around the world that perhaps weren't included in tier one the first time. Yeah, they would be more supportive of the AI diffusion rule. But I think anytime you try to implement export controls, you will get pushback from industry that cares more about commercial interests. But it's really the job of the Trump administration to weigh those commercial interests against national security risks.
And then, assuming that remote access is addressed in some way in these new rules, what are the other most glaring issues that you see that the Trump administration still has to address when it comes to AI export controls?
Yeah, remote access is definitely a big one. I actually have a report coming out soon about remote access and all other, legal gray areas in which Chinese companies are accessing American compute. There's other vectors of access, such as, Chinese companies building data centers kind of wholesale on Malaysian soil or in Southeast Asia, and those are much harder to track. A lot of these Chinese companies also obscure their identity when buying chips or building data centers using shell companies and complex financial arrangements. So I think being able to investigate and understand those incidents and monitor and stop them from happening will be very crucial in export controlling advanced chips.
Well, I'm looking forward to that report. Thank you so much for joining us. That's Michelle Nee, visiting fellow at the Center for a New American Security.
Thank you so
We have some new details on Anthropic's upcoming blockbuster IPO. The company is working on a plan that would let existing shareholders sell some stock during the IPO. Our colleagues Valita Pao and Cory Weinberg wrote this story. Cory joins us now. Cory, what do we know so far about Anthropic's IPO? Do we know when it's happening?
Yeah, it's coming up. We don't know the exact dates. That won't be released for a little bit. But here's what we know about the timeline. We know that the sort of what's going to happen next is Anthropic's going to publicly flip or publicly unveil its IPO prospectus. That will come sometime in September, definitely after Labor Day. These things can always face hangups, but we expect it to be sometime in the first couple weeks after Labor Day, which would put it in line for an early October IPO.
Well, I would say that I hope you're getting some rest before Labor Day and eagerly checking your phone at every notification. But I know you've already been reporting closely on what's happening before then. I mean, the first is this story that you had yesterday with Valita. What did you learn about how Anthropic seems to be treating existing shareholders for this IPO?
Anthropic is taking a different tack than what SpaceX did earlier this year and what Cerebras did earlier this year with their very large IPOs. And that Anthropic is, at least as it stands now, planning to allow existing shareholders to sell at least some stock in the deal. This isn't a complete anomaly. This does happen for various reasons. But traditionally we think of an IPO as this event that raises cash for the company, and we think of it as an event that gets a company public, which will eventually allow its existing shareholders to sell. Because we have generally this norm and this expectation around stock lockups. You can't sell your stock if you're an existing shareholder for a while. If sort of after your IPO. Anthropic, at least as it stands now, seems to be taking an approach where they'll allow existing shareholders to sell some stock in the deal. That would put the stock in, sort of the hands of public investors that Anthropic would be able to choose, and then shareholders would potentially be locked up, not able to sell their stock for potentially even longer than the 180 days that people are generally locked up for. And it's important to say that, look, these are the kind of like real nitty gritty structural issues that a company in sort of is figuring out and deciding ahead of their IPO. And this is obviously a really big IPO, and like pretty much the entire, sort of market economy rides on Anthropic's sort of stock market success right now. And so I think they are doing a lot of deliberations, and this is kind of a structural element that we've heard is sort of likely to come to pass, but they're still hammering things out.
I mean, is that a bearish signal if you have early investors and executives and employees of Anthropic who are trying to offload their shares immediately? This seems like a very ideologically driven company, you'd think they'd want to hold on to their shares if they think this company is a rocket ship going to the moon.
100%. That's like exactly the sensitive issue we were sort of thinking about and trying to get more information around ahead of the story. Um, I think from talking to lawyers and other types of advisors who have worked on a lot of these IPOs, the bankers generally do tell any company, look, you don't want to be selling too much stock in an IPO. It'll look like to everyone like you're dumping, your shares before the stock has, sort of reached its full potential value. Because remember, like an IPO is generally priced, you are generally selling shares at a price that everyone sort of acknowledges is supposed to be uh sort of a discount for the buyer. Like you're not selling at a price that anyone would acknowledge is supposed to be sort of the best price to sell your stock at. So yeah, it can be a little weird, but I think there's some tactical reasons why people may need to do it. They may have a potential tax bill when their stock vests, and so they would need to have like a decent amount of cash for that. It could be to for Anthropic to control how much stock they can put into the hands of like new public shareholders or kind of which shareholders they give stock to. And then it could be because they want to do this other thing, which is have an extended lockup period to ensure that the stock price isn't as volatile as we've seen with SpaceX and Cerebras.
And I think some Anthropic shareholders have to buy galaxies from their wives if public reporting is to be believed.
Yeah, I mean, they need the cash for that. The Martians are not just handing over the other galaxies for a measly billion.
Yeah, still curious how that process works of buying a galaxy, but I guess that's a story for another time. There's something else that you reported in your story, which is a seemingly contradictory policy for how Anthropic is considering letting employees sell stocks after it goes public. Can you just break down what's happening there?
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about with the extended lockup period, and it seems contradictory, but they actually would go hand in hand. Because one of the reasons why you potentially would let existing stockholders sell in the deal is to give them sort of an opportunity to get some liquidity quickly, but need to hang on to their stock for longer than is typical. Generally, with a big stock unlock for a company like SpaceX or a company like Anthropic, where essentially the thing to remember about an IPO is when you go public, because of this lockup period, because existing shareholders generally can't sell, you're only making public a relatively small portion of the actual outstanding shares in the company. And so that just creates, it can create sort of stock price volatility because there's just not that much stock in the hands of public shareholders that can actually trade. And then what creates a lot of volatility and like share price gyrations is this idea of stock becoming unlocked from employees and investors. They're able to sell for the first time. Hedge funds trade around these events, especially like SpaceX and Anthropic, where there's a huge amount of stock that will be coming unlocked. Like there's not many other trillion-dollar companies in the stock market, and these are two companies that will all of a sudden have potentially an outflow of existing shareholders looking to sell. And we've seen that with SpaceX. They did like some early unlock maneuvers, which has sort of people think sort of contributed to its relatively sluggish stock price performance as a public company.
What do we know about the latest valuation for Anthropic?
Yeah, what we reported in our story is bankers have at least discussed 1.5 trillion in recent weeks, but there was a report out from the New York Times last week that said the Anthropic was considering 2 trillion. I think the way I look at it is it's generally too early for anyone to have made decisions on this thing, sort of with enough finality. Like what's happened so far is Anthropic it's filed its S1 confidentially, its IPO prospectus. It did that in early June, late May. In recent weeks, really throughout sort of most of August, it's been meeting with investors, public shareholders, potential people they want to invest in the IPO, and giving them a bit of a look under the hood. It's called a testing the waters meeting. And they're still trying to get feedback on what do public investors want to see from Anthropic, but what resonates with them, what doesn't. And so they're trying to get a sense of price, but price isn't necessarily getting like hashed out at this stage.
And finally, without giving away too many of your reporting tricks, what are you on the lookout over the next few weeks? What's coming next?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the S1 document will be um, a probably the most highly anticipated IPO prospectus, at least in my career. But probably a lot longer than that. And that will, I think, give us a really good look under the hood about the economics of a big AI lab. I think there's so many moving pieces right now in terms of what these companies sell, interact with open weight models. There's a lot on sort of what is actually driving customer demand, where customer concentration is. So these things are going to be picked apart like crazy. And some of the things the company can control what they disclose, or can't control what they disclose because it's you know accounting rules and really strong norms. But companies do have like a decent amount of leeway to decide, like, yeah, this is what we want to tell the world and investors about our business, and this is what we don't. So I think with Anthropic, it is a relatively secretive. It is a very secretive place. It definitely draws comparisons to Apple in terms of corporate secrecy, but there is this sort of really strong cultural element on top of it. So I think that will make this IPO prospectus even more interesting.
Well, I know we'll be able to read it in the information first. Hope you're getting some sleep. That's Cory Weinberg, our senior reporter covering AI and business for the information. I'm excited to be joined by two of the sharpest minds in AI policy who have very different views on the debate over regulation and the role of the state in advancing AI safety. Brad Carson is a former congressman who now leads two AI safety nonprofits, including one of the top AI campaign finance groups. And Adam Thierer is a senior fellow at the R Street Institute and writes widely on AI governance and regulation. Let's start with perhaps the most divisive question in AI policy right now, which is data centers. Adam, I saw your recent critique of Ken Paxton, who's running for Senate in Texas, and argued that data center companies should be held criminally liable for AI chatbots that undermine children's safety. What's happening right now with politicians and data centers? How do you make sense of this?
Well, we're in an environment of fear and loathing, if you will, about data centers. And it seems like this is probably the most repressive set of policies I've seen for digital technology in my 35-year career with regards to data centers. We're talking about banning them outright or placing moratorium on them. The Ken Paxton proposal includes one of the most radical provisions I've ever seen, which is that it would hold data centers liable for what AI chatbots do downstream. That's a little bit like saying that electricity companies should be held liable for anything that is plugged into them, or a newspaper should be held, or an ink maker or a newspaper should be held liable for something else somebody else writes. I mean, we can't have liability work that way. It'll just destroy the industry and destroy speech. So hopefully that's not where we're going to end up on data centers.
Brad, what do you think is the responsible path for approaching data center regulation? Does one even exist?
I think one does exist, and that is that the hyperscalers and the people who work for them have to be more responsive to the communities. Obviously, there's a lot of concern about AI, and I do think that in some ways, data centers are a stand in for a broader concern about the technology. At the same time, there's a lot of opacity, there's massive asymmetries and sophistication between the hyperscalers and, say, a rural county commissioner who's trying to negotiate on it. They're giving away, in many cases, my home state of Oklahoma, we give away our tax base to recruit a hyperscaler in. I think a lot of people have like legitimate questions. So we're going to have to build data centers, no question about that. But I do think there's going to have to be more community involvement, more community transparency, and the hyperscalers are going to have to put up some money to rebuild the schools and the roads to ensure that the power prices don't go up for the companies. That is the path forward, and I think we'll get there.
Adam, I know what you're opposed to with data centers. Do you think that any regulation makes sense? I mean, it's such a hot topic right now. There's a lot of dissent that's going on, but what's the most common sense approach here?
Well, obviously, there's going to be some regulation of data centers, where they're placed and how they're zoned and things like that. That's the same for all industrial buildings of any sort. The real question is, are we going to allow them to be built at all? And the problem is now is that the data centers have become sort of a proxy war for like all of these other concerns about AI policy. All of those different concerns can be addressed in various ways, but we should not address them by essentially demonizing and destroying the infrastructure layer of the entire AI stack. Or else the entire AI revolution and robotics revolution just cannot happen in this country, and it just moves to China and they will lead the globe on it. So we need to take a more focused approach. We can address the various concerns, already addressing obviously concerns about things like electricity and water and various other issues, but it can't become an excuse to try to address everything under the sun with regards to concerns about AI, or else we'll just never have any sort of computational revolution in this country.
Another perpetual flashpoint that may have receded a bit recently, but I think will come back roaring soon, is state versus federal preemption. And at this point, it seems we're not going to get anything out of Congress before the midterms. We're seeing some new state actions, including out of Massachusetts. Brad, should states continue to take action on AI safety and policy?
And they're going to have to. I do think we've won the fight on federal preemption. It still lingers out there in a certain rearguard way, but most members of Congress aren't for it. Republicans generally don't like these kind of attacks on federalism. Democrats think it's a sop to the industry. So while a few people still push it, I think the issue of state preemption is largely won in our favor. I do think the states are going to have to regulate on it. Federal kind of preemption is a natural part of a federal system. So if we have a comprehensive frontier law, it makes sense to preempt states from just duplicating that or working at loggerheads with it. But AI is a broad sector. It's not just the frontier. It goes down into narrow models that have a lot of application in state and local government and companies. Right, that's appropriate for the states to look at consumer protection, civil rights, labor laws, things like that. So I think the key is there's going to be some kind of preemption in the future. It's going to have to come alongside a comprehensive law, probably only on the frontier, while leaving states to regulate what are their historic areas of concern.
Adam, do you think it's a bad idea for states to be taking action here?
Well, I'm very troubled by the rising patchwork of different conflicting, confusing, and costly state and local policies. We're talking about somewhere on the order of 1,850 different AI-related proposals across America right now, and we really have patchworks within patchworks within patchworks. We have states regulating all sorts of interstate activities regarding AI frontier safety, surveillance issues, various types of questions about pricing online, so-called AI bias and fairness. The reality is that some of these things may be right for state activity, but the reality is also that if we have that many different, confusing, overlapping laws, at some point this has massive ramifications for the development of a national marketplace. This is not how we regulated the internet over the past 25, 30 years. Congress set up a national framework on a bipartisan basis with the Clinton-Gore administration. It worked marvelously for the United States, and we developed a world-leading capacity in computation and digital technology and e-commerce. We are seeing a reversal of that, and I'm hugely troubled by it because this is where we need the voice of Congress to sort of equalize things, level the playing field, and make sure we have a clear, consistent policy for the United States and its leadership in global technology.
Brad, what's your response to that critique? This idea that we're just going to have a patchwork of different state laws. Obviously, if you're OpenAI or Anthropic, it's very difficult to deal with 50 very different laws if you're trying to move quickly and building your new models.
I think I have several responses to that. The first is the internet was much more monolithic than AI is. As I mentioned, AI is giving me my Spotify recommendations, the next movie to watch on Netflix. Flock is using it in some ways to understand the surveillance. So all the things Adam talks about are open to a massive federal bill. You have something like the EU AI Act on steroids. If they want to cover surveillance and frontier regulation and civil rights and consumer protection and labor law and kid safety at the federal level, you can honestly talk about a preemptive effect. But really what people who push preemption are to say is like, no, we want no law on those at all. Right? They don't offer a federal standard. They just say like, we'll block the federal government and then try to block the states too. So the internet and frontier models can be analogized in some way. And that's why you're going to have probably a federal law about frontier regulation. But AI is so comprehensive in our society today that you're going to have a lot of state regulation, or else the federal government would have to stand up new agencies. There'd have to be a bundle of new laws. It'd be a massive bureaucracy. It's better for states to handle things like the question, like take surveillance, or algorithmic pricing that that Adam mentioned. You could have a federal law on that. It could have preemptive effect. We're better off allowing states to handle them. That's their historic province. And in fact, that's kind of, the worry about Anthropic and OpenAI complying with 50 laws. Insurance companies do it. Beer manufacturers do it. Lots of companies comply with these kind of things. These are the most sophisticated, in some cases, well-capitalized companies in the world. They can certainly do it. A mom and pop operator can't. That may be true, but they're largely exempted from the kind of things we're talking about.
I think I have a point that you can both agree on, which is what's happening with the Trump administration's approach to AI safety. Adam, what needs to change with what's happening with the White House?
Well, there's certainly a lack of transparency about what's happening right now, and the national security community has asserted itself in a major way into this debate. Of course, that's going to end up being a more secretive process, understandably. But at some point, we're going to have to see some standards put forward with a public revelation of exactly how this is going to work, or else it's going to be a behind closed doors kind of system that ultimately only favors a handful of very large companies. Connecting this to the previous question that you asked about, like these compliance costs and these confusing standards, I mean, let's not shed too many tears about Anthropic or OpenAI. They will be able to probably comply with some of this, but not a lot of other players will. We're talking about driving out a lot of smaller players, especially open source providers. We can't have that kind of a regime if we want competition and innovation to thrive in the United States. We don't want to just fall to a handful of big, large labs. We need a broad, diverse ecosystem. And the combination of this sort of secrecy and lack of transparency and what's happening behind the scenes in the Trump administration, combined with this dreaded patchwork of different conflicting, costly laws that violate interstate commerce in a national marketplace, that spells doom for America's success in global AI and computation.
We reported yesterday that this FINRA for AI model, this idea of standing up a new self-regulatory organization for AI, which has been championed by different AI executives, went as far as having an executive order draft, at least in the White House, but it seems to have stalled. Brad, do you think that's the right approach, this FINRA for AI model?
No, it's not the right approach. I've opposed FINRA in general and have talked a lot about this. When FINRA is put forward, people analogize it to a state bar association, or when Google has been the primary pusher of this idea, talked about the American Medical Association. These are guilds. These are groups that in many ways exist to protect their own membership, not to protect the public. That's why you have other kind of regulation on those industries. And so, no, I don't think FINRA is the right model for that at all. But I will say this. In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. As Adam and I do agree on this point, we have a star chamber system now that's enacting basically a de facto licensing regime, right? We have no idea who's in it. There's no due process to it, absolutely zero transparency, no public input, very little congressional input. The idea that that persists is completely intolerable. So a FINRA model in the meantime is far, far better than that. But FINRA is not going to protect the public and meet the public's concerns about what AI is going to do for it. You're going to have a much more robust regulatory regime. Leaving it to the companies to self-regulate makes very little sense to me.
Adam, what does your ideal federal setup look like for model safety and evaluation?
Well, we're going to probably end up with more proposals along the lines of what we've already seen with Representatives Obernolte and Trahan, and also we're hearing Senator Thune and Klobuchar have a measure ready to go that basically tries to create a federal framework that pulls up some of what's already been passed in states like Illinois, New York, and California, to try to have some frontier model oversight, potentially with independent verification organizations, maybe not on that. I'm not sure it's a FINRA-like model. We have to be careful about these analogies to like other sectors. They don't always work well for general purpose AI or frontier model safety. But we don't need to create a lot of new bureaucracy here. We already have existing bodies that can do a lot of this, including NIST, and within NIST, the Center for AI Innovation and Standards. And we have bodies that can do these sorts of things. But it does take the will of Congress to step up and say we do need a national framework, starting with the frontier model policy, providing some basic transparency requirements and other types of procedures. And then we go from there. We build on an incremental way. We don't need a huge law to do this. You can actually do this more narrowly. And then we can take on some of the other issues we're going to need to preempt on eventually to try to bring some order to this system before chaos prevails among all of these different standards. We just can't have interstate technologies and markets regulated as if we have like an AI Articles of Confederation kind of approach, like a pre-constitutional approach, like anything goes in the states. It just doesn't work if you want to develop a robust and ultimately a safer type of AI ecosystem.
Brad, you lead the Public First Network, which has become one of the largest AI campaign funding groups and faced criticism for its ties to Anthropic. Do you think there's too much AI money in politics right now?
Absolutely. There's too much money in politics, period. Super PACs are a scourge on our democracy, right? The innovation Public First was there was $100 million super PAC set up to quote unquote destroy anybody who favored AI regulation. And rather than just lament that fact, we've formed our own super PAC. But we have diverted effort actually to raise money for the constitutional challenges to the laws that permit super PACs, right? We should not have super PACs, period. But it is important that a single group that set out to, again, to destroy any politician who wanted any kind of AI regulation, even things now they've come around to supporting, right? They had to be counteracted. And that's what Public First is all about.
Adam, what's your take on this? Do you think AI related campaign finance is hurting public perception of the industry?
I mean, look, this is inevitable. Every single sector, technology industry, there's always going to be PACs. There's always going to be lobbying. This is just part and parcel of what happens when issues like this become more politicized. I wish it wasn't the case, but the very fact that there's this much attention, again, 1,800 bills in the United States and hundreds more in Congress. I mean, you're going to have political activity and spending on candidates. I think it's only going to ramp up. We heard NVIDIA is going to do something now with a big new PAC. Yeah, I dread it, but I dread the over politicization of technology more generally. And if you want to end this, you stop that politicization.
Brad, how do you shift public sentiment around AI? Do you think that's even possible?
I think it is possible. I think we need to emphasize what it can do for you. I think the both the labs and the hyperscalers and other people need to be responsible to show how this can benefit them in some way. I mean, I think it's falling into a larger political problem in our country. We're deeply suspicious of authority. People were on the march against the so-called oligarchs before the oligarchs all decamped to San Francisco to create this revolutionary new technology. So AI is falling into a populist moment as a very elite technology. But I think I would just make one point in response to Adam. He talks about the 1,000 or 1,500 bills. There's more than 100,000 bills filed in legislatures each year. The number of bills on AI is just a little bit more than bills on fluoride or trans children. And, what I do find interesting is everyone loves federalism on the right. Oh, the states have to regulate this, right? It has to be at the state level. Federal government should have a minimal presence until you find, right, a lot of money and effort on behalf of a few people in the tech sector, right? We have insurance, we have every business in the country, banking. A lot of these things are regulated at the state and federal level. That is the future of AI. Again, because AI is so diverse in what its application is going to be, that to have a single federal law dealing with all of these kind of things in a sane way is just not only impracticable, but unthinkable. And so that's why you're going to have this mixture of state and federal regulation.
Well, I'm sure we could go all day. We'll have lots of things to talk about in the weeks to come. Thanks to you both. That was Brad Carson, co-founder and president of Americans for Responsible Innovation, and Adam Thierer, senior fellow at R Street Institute. How worried should we be about the cyber risks around AI? This week, over 100 companies and entities signed a letter calling for businesses and policymakers to prioritize cybersecurity. Let's bring in Martin Peers, the Information's co-executive editor, and also our correspondent on open letters for more on this topic. We also heard from Bill Gates this week that he's worried about the risks of AI. How worried should we really be about all of this?
I would say we should be petrified. I mean, we have a situation where a lot of people like Gates and today and all these companies on the cyber stuff overnight are all warning constantly about the dangers of AI, and yet the rest the actual industry is just moving ahead as though that wasn't really happening. And so you've got this sort of split screen thing going on where everyone seems to be aware that we're in the middle of a slow motion car accident where we're all going to get killed or something. I mean, this is a really bad situation. And I don't see that anything's going to actually stop it. Like, I can't see what will actually fix this.
Well, I know that you love open letters. OpenAI, Anthropic, and Microsoft all signed this one. Do you think this one will have any impact?
No, I don't think that anything is going to have any impact. I think we need a administration that actually is smart and is paying attention and is willing to actually take action. Right now, the administration is run by a bunch of clowns. It's really that they're not serious people, so you can't really expect that that we'll get anything out of them. And to be fair, they are trying to take a hands-off approach. There's always the concern that if the US really takes tough action to regulate AI, that China might just move ahead and we could be left behind. And so obviously that would be pretty bad. I think this is the problem. But the real issue is we need some kind of um, joint action between the companies, including the companies which are developing the AI, and regulators. They can't just keep talking past each other as though, it's fine to sort of warn of the dangers of AI while then continuing to develop the most powerful model that you can.
Well, let's talk about the companies. Obviously, these companies developing the technology wrote this open letter together. Do you really think it means they'll be prioritizing safety, given it's their technology they're developing, not to mention their pressing business concerns?
I got to believe that the reason they put that out is that they're trying to make everyone aware, all the businesses that use any kind of digital tech, they're trying to make everyone aware that they have to really take, defensive measures. It's always been a kind of a afterthought, and clearly the bigger companies are really trying to say, "Wake up! We really have to take action." I'm just not really convinced that that will work. I think the problem is that we've been hearing these kind of warnings now repeatedly, and after a while, people just sort of you know, drown them out. So I'm just not confident that without action from Washington, that anything will happen. And I don't think we will get that because the people in Washington are just too distracted.
I mean, I think the subtext of these letters is almost always more interesting than the context or the content of them. In this one, they called on the government to fund cyber defense. We had a whole executive order about that in June, specifically about bolstering cyber defense from the government. Why do you think the companies are writing this letter now?
I mean, I think that they're just aware that the powerful models are getting more and more dangerous. I think the idea, though, that asking the government to fund it doesn't make much sense. The government doesn't have the money. We're in a terrible fiscal situation, and the companies that are making a fortune from AI should be the ones paying for the defenses. So that's what I would be doing. I wouldn't be saying to the government, "You should fund this." No, it's up to the all the NVIDIA, for instance, which is making a fortune from AI, they should be helping fund it. It's not the government, which is really taxpayers.
Well, how do you think the Trump administration is likely to respond to the letter? Is there a contradiction there given their professed hands off approach to AI regulation?
Well, Leo, I should ask you that. You're actually smarter on this than I am. My guess is that they'll just ignore it. But why don't you actually answer the question, your own question?
I'm the host today. I don't
I
know.
know, but you're smarter on this than I am. It feels a bit weird you asking me the question when you probably know the answer and you're probably thinking, he doesn't know what he's talking about.
It wasn't a trick question, I promise. I don't know. As I said, I think it's interesting given that there was this June executive order that ostensibly was addressing these concerns. One of the programs out of that was this Gold Eagle clearinghouse. That's this idea that all of the companies can together share their concerns and they'll be dealt with in one unified body. And that's theoretically live and operational. So I'm still a bit confused why this letter is coming when the Trump administration already dealt with it in some
Well,
way. So yeah.
just remember, you cannot govern the country by executive order. I know that Trump thinks that that's the case, but I mean, anyone with a brain knows that that's not true. So I think you need more than an executive order to fix this issue, and that's probably why the companies are responding. They're saying the current measures that we have taken are not enough. We have to do more.
Well, lucky for us, Congress loves passing bills, so I'm sure we'll see some.
Oh yeah, it's just great.
Talking about executive orders, I wrote an article yesterday that the Trump administration has internally circulated a draft executive order calling for the creation of a SRO or self-regulatory organization for AI companies that produce state-of-the-art models. It seems like it's stalled, it's hitting some obstacles. I mean, what do you think is the right way for the government to actually regulate these companies?
As I said earlier, I think the right way is that the government should get smart people, which I'm not sure that this administration can actually do that. They should get the smart people from the industry to sit down and work out what has to be done. They should all sit in a room, and everybody who's involved, NVIDIA, OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, everybody. And they should work with the smartest people in the government to come up with some concrete plan. I'm just not confident that's going to happen.
Well, I'll make a plug here. I'm going to be attending the G20 innovation meeting where OpenAI and NVIDIA at least will be there with a couple government offices. So if you're there and want to tell me what's going on, please do. Last
Yeah,
question
you
for
know
you.
very well that I will not be there. You'll be there. Why?
Yeah, I'll be there. Yeah, tell me. You can email Martin if you want. Who benefits the most from this lack of regulation?
China, probably. And the bad guys. Maybe they're the same, but I don't think so.
Well, I'm glad we could end this episode on a high note. Thank you so much, Martin. That's Martin Peers, co-executive editor at The Information. That does it for today. A reminder, we are on this stream Monday through Friday at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. If you can't make it then, episodes are available on theinformation.com, our YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to follow us on social media on X, Instagram, and TikTok. And don't worry, Akash will be back for Monday's show. Have a great weekend.